Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys about one of the questions I get asked a lot. It has to do with for me personally, has to do with for my clients. And people ask, how close to failure and how hard do you have people push their medium to high rep supplemental exercises, their multi-joint ones? And I think that's a very good question to ask, and we do need to differentiate between multi-joint versus single joint here. And you guys will notice I'm doing in the background examples. I'm doing closed grip pressing, I'm doing weighted dips, I'm doing pendlay rows. These are examples of multi-joint supplemental exercises. Now, a lot of people would say, well, what if you're not a power lifter? Well, this is going to be a strength-based channel, and I don't care what your sport is or what you compete in. If you are pursuing strength, you're going to have exercises to where you do very, very heavy weight with low reps. It might be the squat, bench, and deadlift, but it might be the sumo deadlift, it might be the box squat, it might be the floor press, it might be the standing press. Right? You might have different exercises that you utilize. Right? Maybe you compete in strength lifting, or whatever it is that you happen to do singles on. In my case, I have dozens of exercises I do singles on, dozens of variations, and we count those as basically primary exercises or as assistance movements to a primary exercise, because I train maxes on assistance movements, and that's standard in the conjugate type system. Right? That's standard, that's normal. You train heavy singles on those, you take them to maxes. So everything else is what we're talking about. The exercises that we train for volume for the purpose of adding hypertrophy, because we don't get that big off of just singles. And I want that point to be clear. Just said not that big doesn't mean they don't have any stimulating effect. And I've seen debates on this too, and looking at studies where they've taken people and had them test a 1 rep max every 2 weeks. Well, that affects the training, because training to a 1 rep max on a big exercise every 2 weeks has a training effect. You are going to get some muscle growth out of it in a larger program. It's just not going to be nearly as effective as doing 3 or 5 sets of 10. It's not even going to be in the ballpark, but it will have some effect, and that cannot be discounted. So these exercises are perfect examples. My good mornings, my hip thrusts, all that stuff you guys see me do, those are examples. Right? They're multi-joint movements. So how close should we take them to failure? Well, I would say it depends on the safety of the exercise. Okay, it depends on the safety of the exercise. Is it fairly safe to take a closed grip bench press all the way to failure if you wanted? Sure, because you got safeties in place. Right? Hopefully you're using safeties. You got a spotter. Can you take a pendlay row all the way to failure? Sure. But we'll talk about that in a second, of the problems with that. What about a dip? I don't know that it's safe to take a weighted dip to absolute failure. Notice when I get really grindy on the last rep, I don't do the eccentric. I go ahead and just stop at the top and stand up. What about a good morning? You think it's safe to take a good morning all the way to failure? Maybe, but only if you're doing it off of pins, not the standard one where you're getting a stretch reflex. Right? You're going to failure in an exercise that's pulling you over and potentially straining your low back. Well, it's not safe to take that to failure. You can get real close. But an exercise like that has such a massive stretch reflex that maybe it's not necessary. So what's my strategy? Well, watch what I do on these closed grip presses. Guys will see me do a bunch of touch and go. And then when it starts to get heavy, because I've usually picked a weight to where I can squeeze out. Say for me, if I'm doing 5x10, I'm selecting a weight I can do roughly 5x10 on. In this case, I've got 230 on the bar there. I can do 5 sets of 10 on that. I might only be able to get 8 or 9 on the last set. Well, that's kind of what you're shooting for. So if I've selected a weight in which I can do that, my goal is to just do touch and go until I get really fatigued. You guys will notice as I start to get really, really close to failure, I start pausing at the top. Pause at the top, hold it locked out, take a deep breath again just to give yourself a little bit of a break. And then when I know that I can only do one more rep, I try to pause so that we get a nice, good effect in the chest, and then try to drive it up. Okay. Basically, on a lift like this, we try not to necessarily go to absolute failure. And absolute failure is not what people make it out to be. It's not doing forced reps. Okay. Failure is when the upper threshold fibers are no longer capable of recruiting and doing any more reps because you fatigue them. Going beyond that doesn't seem to have any growth stimulus, contrary to what some bodybuilders believe. It's just masochism. So what I will oftentimes do is do that and take it within 1 rep of failure. Or we start to look for form breakdown. We start to look for grinding. A lot of times on my dips, usually when I go to push that 1 rep up, if that feels hard, I know that if I were to try 1 more rep, I'm probably not going to get it. Because sometimes I do hit failure on them, right? You guys just see me stop. Sometimes I hit failure. Like I do 1 more, then I start to do the eccentric and I put my feet down when I feel like I can't press it up again. All right, it's momentary muscle failure. But the thing is, you can approach momentary muscle failure to where you know that if you were to keep pumping, you might come up a rep short and you can pause briefly. Same thing with the Pendlay rows. For me on the Pendlay row, because this is a very strict explosive movement, and this is what you have to base this stuff on. You've got to look at the individual movement. For something like this is a strict explosive movement. If I have to start cheating to do a rep, I've reached failure. That's muscle failure. Muscle failure means when you can no longer complete another rep with strict form. Okay? And at the end of these, as I start to get fatigued, I pause more at the bottom. When I feel that the form is starting to break down potentially, we pause just briefly so that we can try to squeeze out 1 more. But as you guys notice, as we get a little further into the set, sometimes there's a little more body swing. I try to pause and control it. But when we reach a point where right there, notice I had to use a little bit of cheat to bring the weight up. Well, that's because I wasn't strong enough. I didn't have my lats were not strong enough to pop the weight off the floor on their own with good form. So I had to cheat. It's basically removing about 10 pounds of the weight. All right, that's basically muscle failure. Failure doesn't mean you go until you have to grind out a rep and then you get pinned after. Failure means when you can't complete 1 more rep with good form. Right? So that's what we're doing. We're trying to get within 1 rep of failure. And that's a good metric. But on exercises that you can pause on, like your close grip press, you can get a little closer because you can take them to where you go, man, I've only got 1 rep in the tank. And then if you pause on that rep, that makes it slightly harder. So then you drive up with everything that you have, and you know that you've hit all the upper threshold fibers. So we just want to get really close. Now, here's the downside to some of that. Going to true failure instead of 1 rep short isn't guaranteed to cause more muscle growth. All right, the research on that is very ambiguous. But what is it that we know? Every rep closer you get to failure does have a larger hypertrophic response. Okay, that isn't debated. In other words, if you take a close grip press like this, let's say you're using a weight that is your 10 rep max, and if you were to try an 11th rep, it's going to fail. It's just going to stick on your chest, or you're going to lift it 4 inches, it's going to come back down. Rep 8 causes more muscle growth than Rep 7 does. It has a larger fatiguing response. Rep 9 is actually more productive than Rep 8, and Rep 10 seems to cause a slightly greater degree of stimulus than Rep 9 did. Like the reps are actually higher quality. So we want to get as close as we can. We want to get as close as we can. And if we happen to hit failure, all right, but that gives us a metric. We know our strength level. We know our strength level based on that. But we do want to get within 1 rep of it. We want to get within 1 rep of it so that we get the highest quality that we can. We want to get the highest quality that we can. Now, in some cases, on some of these exercises, if they're so fatiguing, you might need to, if you're taking shorter breaks, you might have to do drop sets. In my case, I try to take long enough breaks because I have a limitless free time. I take like 3 minutes easily between all these, so that I can complete pretty much my sets. But sometimes the fifth set, I can't get all of them, even with the 3-minute breaks. Well, that means I've picked a weight very, very effectively because I can't get all 10 on the 5th set. So that's what we're looking at, is the amount of fatigue that we're creating inside the rep and volume that we want. But as far as taking them to 1 rep short of failure, it's probably ideal. You have to be more careful on some exercises than others. It's a safety issue. But generally, we want to get very close. The only downside is that when we come back over to that model where we talked about that 11th rep, attempting that 11th rep and failing it doesn't produce muscle growth because the upper threshold fibers were too exhausted. You didn't really recruit anything further, but it could beat up your recovery on a big exercise. On a smaller exercise, that might not be as true. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.